Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started.
Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I am your host, Dr. Heidi Horsley, and I'm here today with my guest, Sundari Malcolm. And unfortunately, my mom, Gloria, can't join us today because she is in Germany on vacation. And I just learned that Sundari lives in Germany, which is very cool. So we are going to be talking to her today about moving through the hurricane of grief. And Sundari is a native New Yorker. She was raised with the teachings of integral yoga. In 2007, at 27 years old, and after 7 years of being her caregiver, Sundari lost her mother to breast cancer. 4 years later, she lost her father to brain cancer. Sundari is the BIPOC grief educator and care curator for the dinner party. She is a birth, grief, and death doula and founder of A Healing Doula. And she is the author of Grief Gems, a roadmap to help us move through the hurricane of grief, which is why, Sundari, I named our show today, Moving Through the Hurricane of Grief. So welcome to our podcast, and thank you for being here today from Germany.
Thank you for having me. Hello to those who are listening and to your community.
Thank you. So I guess I want to start out, you've had some very significant losses dealing with the death of both your parents. And I wanted to start out talking with you a little bit about your story.
Okay. I always think it's important to start at the beginning to give context for where I am now, which is my mother had been studying to be a Swami. And for those who don't know, that's a spiritual monk, a spiritual guide. And her mother was diagnosed with ALS at the age of 55, and she moved home to be her caregiver and met my father. And when my mother was 55, she passed, and I was her caregiver. But we were both the same ages. I was raised between New York City and a yoga ashram, and so raised and surrounded by spiritual teachings and indigenous healers and ancient practices. And in my 20s, as I was just graduating from the University of Delaware, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer for the second time. And I came home to be her caregiver and spent 7 years that way.
Wow.
And at the time, I was not, although I had been raised a certain way, at the time I was a PR girl on Park Ave in New York City. And I was not at all on this path. And I was still kind of struggling between wanting to be in my 20s and watching all of my friends get engaged and get married and build their careers. And I was kind of shuttling back and forth between New York City and Westchester, New York. And at a certain point, it became apparent that I had to become a full-time caregiver and that I had to give up work and I had to really make the decision to be home full-time. And so I did that, and eternally grateful that I did, but it was not without struggle, right? Being a caregiver is hard. I'm an only child. My father was not in the home at the time. And
you were
we didn't have a
young.
whole, I was young. I was 27. Well, I was 23, 22, 23, when she said that her cancer had returned.
Wow.
And so she passed when I was right before I was turning 28. And it was a long, really hard road. She died when I was 27. And then a few years later, I came home from a holiday and I got a call that my father was in a coma at Mount Sinai. And at this point, we had been estranged for years. He was not a part of my caregiving of my mother. We had had estrangement since I was in junior high school. And so this was complicated, right? And this is what we talk about when we talk about complicated grief. This was a man that I loved because of blood, but didn't really know and had really hard relationship with. And because of the lack of family, I wound up being a part-time caregiver for him as well. And the grief since then has been different, right, than what it was with my mother, because it's two different sorts of relationships. And it was after the loss, before the loss of my father, it was really after the loss of my mother when I recognized like I needed, after a year of laying on my couch really and watching the Food Network and not doing a whole lot, of realizing that I really needed to shift gears and that I had felt so alone as a caregiver. And I had felt so lost after losing her and hadn't been able to find the resources that spoke to me.
Well, and I'm
Um,
thinking, Sundari, here you were not only dealing with the grief, but your role was to be a caregiver, and
yes,
your identity and your life was all about this. And then your mom dies. I can only imagine how lost you were, like you said, like, what now? Where do I go now? How do I deal with the
absolutely.
hurricane of grief at this point?
Absolutely. I was lucky that I'll be honest, in the beginning, I think we all know what grief fog feels like, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which was like when it first happened, I didn't call on any tools, any practices. I was stunned. And as you start to move your way through the fog is when I started to realize exactly what you said. I had lost an identity, right? I had come straight from college. And though I had had a job, it hadn't been very long lasting before she had gotten really sick. Um, and now I didn't know who I was at 27. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't really know what direction to go in. And the first thing that really called to me was to go take a yoga class again,
Mm.
and to go meditate and to go to a center that I knew in the village. And that's what shifted everything for me. It was just returning.
I love this. So tell me more. I mean, I love the practice of yoga, and my family's very involved in yoga. I'm wondering, what about yoga and meditation helped you? For those out there that don't know about it.
I think, the the background of yoga, the intention of yoga from whichever civilization you attribute it to, because it goes back much further than we're usually taught, is that it was an intentional binding of your soul, your mind, and your body, right? And I think especially when you're new to grief and when you're in the hurricane of it, you are so disconnected from your body. And it can be really scary to get back into the body because there's so many feelings waiting for you there. But I felt like if I was in a group, if I was in a class, if there was someone talking, it at least would keep me kind of flowing through whatever bubbled to the surface. I think it gave me a sense of community again, right? Of people who maybe weren't talking about grief, but at least they were talking about something deeper than what was happening in other conversations I was having, right? Um, I think meditation, oftentimes people think that it's like the clearing of your thoughts, and really it's not. It's learning to allow them to pass by without attaching to them.
Mm.
And as a griever, I was attached to them, right? Every thought that came in my head, I was running down to the ground, every image, every memory. And I had to get a handle on allowing what came up to learn how to witness it, but not become attached to it. And I think that what I remembered and why I also moved back to it was I believe in talk therapy and I believe in how the Western world approaches it, but I also believe that energy is real.
Mm-hmm.
And all of our answers that I've studied ancient cultures for a long time now. And what I can say is globally, all of our ancestors understood that you needed to move energy and you needed to transmute it and you needed to get it up and out of your body. And so I think any movement that is intentional and slow, so whether that's yoga or qigong, people think somatic movement is new. It is not. It is ancient, and it is because it will shift what's
I,
happening. So I
I
went.
absolutely agree with this, Sundari. And I just want to say that a lot of people get anxious or nervous to start doing this because they think, well, I can't even touch my toes. I'm not a yogi. I can't stand on my head. I can't do all these
Yeah.
things. I'm like, you don't have to do that. There's different kinds of yoga. I mean, restorative yoga is amazing. There's,
Restorative
and like
yoga,
you
you move
said,
like 6 times and you spend most of the time on the floor, and it's phenomenal. Like,
and like you said, our grief gets trapped in our bodies and stuck. And as a psychologist, I do talk therapy, but I can only do so much. You
yeah.
need to do body work with that. I 100% agree with you. I love what you've done with your own grief. And I know that you done you did the yoga and the meditation, and then you did something with something called the dinner party. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yes. So when I shifted my own work, I started teaching yoga classes, which led me to yoga for grief and yoga for cancer, and being trained in then trauma work, and that kind of unfolded into all of this other work, grief and death doula work. And I went to the dinner party though as a griever in 2013. So for people who don't know, the dinner party is a nonprofit that serves people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who are experiencing loss. And one person is matched with 10 to 12 people at what is known as a table. When we were in person, so this was prior to the pandemic, I'll give an example of me. I lived in Miami at the time. And so everyone who was in my zip code, who was in my age range, was matched to me. And every other Sunday, I would open
Oh.
up my house for brunch and we would all meet. Because of the pandemic, we've shifted a lot of our work to virtual, which actually has become beautiful because if you lived in a place like Miami, New York, LA, it was great for you, right? If you were in a small town in the middle of the United States, it could be really hard to find 10 other people who had also heard of this org, who had also signed up, right? And so you could be on a wait list for years. And so now, because it's virtual, you could be anywhere in the world and can still be connected to people. So I joined as a griever and I became a host. And so people were matched to me. And through my work, I started to realize how much I loved working with caregivers and grievers, and that this wasn't something I just wanted to kind of do. And I joined a staff, and that role has grown because what I've continued to recognize, and why my title is BIPOC grief educator, is that while I've continued to work in grief, is that our grief is a thread that bonds all of us, but the nuances of our grief are specific to how we process our loss. And one of those is our identities. And when we were watching specifically the civil rights movement surge in the US, and we recognized that in our community, the headlines, the collective grief was impacting acute and personal grief, right? And so we needed to set up spaces that were specifically for BIPOC folks so they could sit and hold the headlines.
So for people that don't know what BIPOC is, tell us a little bit about that.
So it's an acronym for Black,
Yep.
Indigenous, People of Color. And what we realized was that people who fell into the BIPOC umbrella or fell under the BIPOC umbrella needed a different level of care. And so we started creating affinity spaces and then started training our community in how to hold these open grief spaces while not ignoring the headlines, right? While not acting like what is happening on the main stage is not happening in the bodies of people that are showing up. And then what we saw was that other people deserved a mirror also, right? And that this was healing for everybody. And so we started creating affinity groups across the spectrum. So sibling loss tables, sudden loss tables, widow spaces.
So the dinner
And
party, I love this idea. So
yeah,
it's like peer support. But you're matching people with similar experiences and with lived experiences that may be
yes,
similar. So you're
yes.
really creating incredible peer support spaces, safe spaces for people that are
It's
going
really
through
been
grief.
beautiful.
I love
It's
this.
really
I love this idea.
beautiful. And we get questions about like, well, why only 20s, 30s, and 40s? And it really, that was an intentional move by the founders. those were years that seemed to be very transitional for people, right? Not everyone has a set family then. Not everybody has their set job then. A lot of people might and there were so many services that were serving people 50 and older or were serving children. And there was this age range that was kind of getting lost in the sauce.
That makes sense, Sundari. I mean, I was 20 when my brother died, and I completely relate to what you're saying, because I wasn't a child, but I wasn't like an older adult. And I was like, there was nothing for me at that time. And also people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s often don't lose their parents and their siblings, and they don't have those kind of losses until they're older. So sometimes you can feel like I'm the only one. I mean, for you, having no parents as young as you were, that's fair. In your dad died when you were your early 30s?
I was 31. Yeah.
You were young.
So
You were young. I mean, to be kind of an orphan, I hate to say that word, but you lost your mom very young. You lost your father very young. I'm sure most of your friends had their parents.
All of them, right? I was one of all. And what I learned through the dinner party was that I wasn't alone, right? That there were actually thousands of orphans just like me. And that I could even be really specific and say, I only want the ones in Miami, or I only want to talk to the ones that, that look like me. Or I could sit in these shared spaces if I wanted. But I think that's something that the dinner party's been really beautiful at, is reminding people that they're not alone, and that though you might not find this in your circle, your group, or your class, that you will find it here.
So Sundari, I want to jump to your book. Yes. So your book is Grief Gems and a roadmap to help us move through the hurricane of grief. Tell us a little bit about Grief Gems.
In 2018, I converted a school bus and traveled through the US.
Wow.
And it was my decision to leave the US was right after George Floyd was murdered. And I went to Curacao, which is called the Healing Island. And it was there that I really went through what I call like a energetic detachment. Did a lot of self-work. And I realized that I wanted to I wanted to continue to put out into the world what I hadn't found. And I had read a lot of books that were written by people much older than me when I was 27. And that were written much wordier, is what I say, right? Like they are all very text heavy. And when I felt ready enough to write a book, though I'm not 27 or 31 anymore, I felt like I wanted to write what I couldn't find. And I wanted to write something that felt really honest and felt like you would understand my story, but also see yourself in it. I wanted to tell people the truth, that this is something you're going to walk with forever. Like, I wanted to speak to the elephant in the room, but also empower people to know that there were things that we can do, right? And that there are long-standing practices and long-standing traditions that can help us swim.
So can you give us a couple of things that people could do right now?
One of the things that I put in my book is something that I created called the self-care bowl. And that is to get a bowl and get a piece of paper and rip it up into like 20 pieces and write on each little piece something that you need to get done throughout your week, your month, that is going to keep moving you forward. And it can be everything from take a shower, wash your hair, right? Eat a salad, call grandma, whatever it is. But when you pick it, you have to do it, or you at least have to put the plan into place to do it, because maybe the time doesn't allow. What this does is put you back on some sort of forward movement, right? Because usually in the hurricane of it, you are stuck and you are not making the best choices, and rightly so, for your health or your mental health, your physical health, connecting with community, taking care of things that might help you feel a bit better, if only superficially. But it was something that I've seen with myself, that I've seen with clients and with students, that it gets you out of the shame cycle and that shame spiral when you're grieving of, I'm so sad, I need to do XYZ. I didn't do XYZ. Now I feel guilty about not having done that. It gives a little buoy of help. Something else, breath work. You don't have to close your eyes. You don't need to sit in darkness. You can do this on the train. You can do this on the toilet. You can do this wherever you need to. But there is a real biological response that comes when you practice breathing, right? So even if you are not ready to emotionally handle the depths of your grief, even if you're not ready to sit and give voice to it, you can very passively help shift it and balance your nervous system by practicing breath. And the easiest one I can think of is breathe into 4 and breathe out to 6, and try to do that as slow as you can and concentrate on the numbers. That's it.
Thank you so much. And these are practical things that people can do right now when this podcast ends today. So thank you. And thank you so much for everything you're doing to help people find hope after loss. You are a true example of someone that has had very significant losses in your life, very young, and gone on to not only survive, but thrive. And we always like to say it, open to hope. If you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own. And God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.